Hello. Start. Okay, good morning, everybody. It's lovely to see everybody here finally. I know we have people who've traveled from far and wide to come, and so thank you very much. Especially welcome our colleagues from Latin America who are here, and we'll be very pleased to hear about your experiences in the next couple of days. So probably without further ado, I will proceed with the opening ceremony, and I'd like to invite Vice President Groff. Stephen is the Vice President for East Asia, Southeast Asia, the Pacific, and the Central Operations Services of ADB. Steve.
Thank you, Farzana. Let me just get the technology working here. Well, good morning, everyone. Secretary Abad, Minister Roberto Gallardo, distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is really a pleasure for me to join you here this morning and make a few remarks at this important forum. And this forum is the result of an innovative partnership between three banks: the Asian Development Bank, in which we're sitting today, the CAF Development Bank of Latin America, and the Inter-American Development Bank. And this partnership aims to increase knowledge sharing, policy dialogue, and cooperation between the Asia-Pacific region and the Latin America and Caribbean region. It brings together members of the community of practice for managing for development results in Latin America and the Caribbean and in the Asia-Pacific, both of which are sponsored by the IADB and the ADB, respectively. Even before the partnership, these two COPs have been cooperating in promoting the results agenda from the 2005 Paris Declaration. In fact, in preparation for the 2011 High-Level Forum in Busan, they worked together with a COP from Africa to deliver the Seoul Statement, a partner country-driven statement to the donors supporting the results orientation of public sector management as a key means to ensure sustainable development effectiveness. COPs, as we all know, are one of the most useful vehicles for promoting a common understanding of issues and for knowledge sharing. They have been identified as one of the key modalities in South-South cooperation and dialogue among their members. Sharing development knowledge and expertise can help solve common development challenges across and within regions. While developing countries have substantial results in various domains, expanding opportunities for direct cooperation remains an urgent need and an area of great potential. In this respect, the regions of Latin America and the Caribbean and the Asia-Pacific have a lot to share that is both common and different. I will not expound upon the benefits and advantages of South-South cooperation, as I am sure we all here are in agreement in that regard. I will therefore talk briefly on the subject of decentralization. Decentralization, deconcentration, devolution are terms used to describe the processes that countries have embraced, processes driven by a recognition that the most effective and accountable government is that government that is closest to its people. ADB, and I'm sure IADB, do not necessarily prescribe decentralization as a panacea for effective development, but we have been there to help support the transition of many of our member countries in their desire to move from a more centralized to a more decentralized form of government. This has been done through the support at policy level, through legal and regulatory reform, and through various investments in technical assistance projects. There is one clear lesson that we have learned. It is not always an easy road, and there is no one-size-fits-all approach. However, countries can benefit significantly from learning the experience of each other. COP meetings such as these will allow you to share such experiences and perhaps take home new and different ideas. Both regions have different lessons to share. Asia has much to share in its experiences in education systems, science and technology, outward-oriented policies that lead to the formation of regional supply chains, public-private partnerships, and regional financial cooperation initiatives. Similarly, Asia can benefit from studying Latin America's experience in poverty reduction, social safety net policies, agricultural policies, and the promotion of sustainable cities, among others. At the same time, there are challenges that are also similar. Both regions are comprised of countries covering a broad development spectrum, from fragile states to developed states. And even with their developed and middle-income countries, they share the common paradox of extreme deprivation and poverty in urban slums that share the skyline with high-rise towers of their leading cities. Reconciling these two faces of development is one of the major challenges of our time. In closing, I would like to once again congratulate the two secretariats of the Communities of Practice of Latin America and the Caribbean and the Asia Pacific for taking up the challenge of putting together such a forum. I wish you a productive 2 days. I now have the great pleasure of handing over the podium to my good friend, Secretary Butch-Abad, for him to give some opening remarks. Secretary Abad, please.
Thank you, Steve, Director Jane, the other officials of ADB are here. Distinguished guests and participants to this forum, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. If I appear rather slow today, it's because I had to stay up late last night to pass my budget in the Senate, so I have to be able to get it done before the holidays. I have entitled my address to you this morning in this manner: the Aquino administration, by the people and back to the people. By the people, because that was how this administration uniquely ascended to power. As in 1986, in that historic people power revolution, in 2010, our people once again lifting themselves up from the clutches of desperation and hopelessness, presided over another popular presidential draft, the second in our history, and elected a reluctant Benigno S. Aquino III as president of our country. While his mother, our icon of democracy, Corazon Aquino, was swept to power by the unprecedented people power revolution of 1986, Noynoy Aquino, her son, successfully fought his political battle in the treacherous arena of electoral politics, the domain of traditional politics dominated by what we call the 3 Gs of Philippine politics: guns, goons, and gold. Against all odds, Noynoy Aquino prevailed. And I say back to the people because that is the underlying political agenda of this administration. In a word, we call it empowerment. In your conference theme, I believe, that's at the heart of decentralization. This is the democratic project of the Aquino administration. Today, we experience and enjoy various degrees of democracy in this country. We also know that democracy is for naught if we fail in ensuring other fundamental freedoms, not only the political, but also the economic and social. In our case, we continue to experience these problems even after we regain in a dramatic fashion our democracy 25 years ago, and especially in the last decade, where corrupt and inept governance further deepened poverty, underdevelopment, and social conflicts in our society. That's why on this backdrop, people power again emerged as 2.5 years ago when President Aquino was elected with a resounding mandate. The resurgence of people power happened, as I said, not via mass action in the streets to topple a dictatorship, but through a clear instruction from the people, through their ballots, for the new leadership to rebuild public trust in government institutions, bolster their capacity to govern and deliver, and to bring the power back to the people. In response to this phenomenon, President Aquino entered into a social contract with the people to reduce poverty and promote inclusive economic growth through honest and effective governance. What does this mean for local governance and decentralization in this country? Let me tell you that the beginnings of the decentralization process in the Philippines started during the restoration of institutions under President Corazon Aquino. In particular, this was when our new democratic constitution that was ratified in 1987, and it asserted, and I quote, "Local government units shall enjoy local autonomy." This constitutional provision was later on fleshed out under the Local Government Code, which was passed in 1991. This, for one, paved the way for automatic allocation and release of 40% of all national internal revenue taxes to local governments. These early reforms were essentially inspired by people power, by the desire to reverse the inefficient, unresponsive, and politically manipulable framework of central control by the national government, or at that time, by the Marcos dictatorship. More important, local autonomy at that time was driven by the desire to make local government units, or what we call LGUs, more responsive to the needs of constituents on the ground. After all, the LGUs are supposedly the closest and most proximate representations of government for the people. Was this early reform successful? We have seen mixed results and extreme cases. But more fundamentally, we see in local governments today the predominance of a socio-political culture that has been at the root of problems of dependency and poverty in this country. We call it patronage. Patronage is a situation where citizens, especially the poor, are tied to relationships of dependence and inequity with a few elites. It is where, for the life cycle of a poor person, he depends on the generosity of the patron for survival in exchange for keeping him in power. The patron's ability to stay in power and keep the loyalty of his clients is a function of how he is able to influence the allocation of resources and decision-making by institutions of the national government. Politics then becomes the patron's guarantee of sustaining influence. In the end, the continued reign of patronage and influence peddling weakens the ability of the state and its component public institutions to govern. That is, to fairly mediate competing interests, allocate scarce government resources, and equitably facilitate economic opportunity. Democracy will continue to be just formal and nominal if we do not decisively address the culture of patronage. And thus, the Aquino administration is pursuing a democratic project to supplant patronage with a new culture of empowerment. Empowerment, I believe, is achieved when people are given a free rein on their lives, when they are given equal opportunity, when those in the margins are given a fair shot through public investments in their welfare, and when they are given a greater, quote-unquote, voice and vote. We believe that empowerment can be achieved by pursuing these imperatives. Number one, restoring people's trust in government and its formal institutions. Number 2, strengthening public institutions' capacity to deliver results. And number 3, building a consolidated constituency for sustained reforms. If there is one area of governance where we should truly pursue these imperatives of empowerment, it should be in local governance. Let me start with the need to fortify the local government unit's capacity to deliver services and undertake key projects. For one, we can work on improving the absorptive capacity of national government agencies, but it will only be possible up to a point. At the same time, we have realized that selected local government units already have the capacity to deliver frontline services, particularly in social protection and livelihood, and for some, in infrastructure development. With this, we thought, why don't we push resources down to local government units with proven capacity? With this, various national government agencies have entered into partnerships with leagues of local government units in the implementation of priority social infrastructure projects such as schools, water supply, rural health centers, among others. This administration wants to encourage and support local government units to adopt better service delivery and resource management systems. For one, we are pursuing a local government public financial management program to strengthen the revenue, planning, budgeting, and implementation capacities of local government units. Which leads to my next point. We assert that local autonomy and devolution should come together with greater accountability. That's me. This addresses the first imperative of empowerment, of working to rebuild public trust. In light of this, the local government public financial management support program that we are pursuing also seeks to strengthen local government unit accountability, transparency, and financial stewardship through enhanced monitoring and evaluation, as well as stronger internal audit. Of course, with the prevailing culture of patronage, we can only make local government units swallow accountability to a certain extent. We realize that there is a greater need to incentivize the adoption of accountability by local government units. We pursued this, and this was the initiative of the late Secretary Jesse Robredo, through the Seal of Good Housekeeping and the Performance Challenge Fund of our Department of Interior and Local Government. Under these initiatives, local government units which disclose budget information to their constituents and fulfill good governance benchmarks may have greater access to additional funds for their priority projects. We are also tying up the implementation of joint projects by national agencies and local government units to the latter's fulfillment of governance standards. There is another paradigm on devolution that we should consider: the empowerment of citizens, particularly the communities, as well as the civil society organizations who represent them. We must emphasize to local government units that greater devolution requires greater accountability, and that greater accountability requires giving a greater voice and vote to their constituents. Empowerment should not stop at the level of local government units themselves. Ultimately, it should reach their constituencies or the people. An initiative that may be of interest to you, who mostly represent central finance agencies, is the bottom-up budgeting exercise that we are starting or experimenting on starting this year. In 609 municipalities, with an allocation of 8.4 billion pesos for local programs and projects, which were developed through this new process. We told these municipalities that before they can access resources, they must partner with community and civil society organizations in their localities in arriving at projects for their communities. By next year, for the crafting of the 2014 national budget, we hope to be scaling up the bottom-up process by expanding the initially covered set of 609 municipalities to more than 1,200. We envision that through the years, the national budget will be shaped more and more by the local governments and communities rather than by the central government alone. Empowerment requires the building of a consolidated constituency that will support as well as sustain the demand for critical governance reforms. We assert that we cannot succeed via the government's actions alone. We need our allies, our partners from the broad and diverse community of civil society organizations, community organizations, business groups, professionals, academe and development partners. With this, I would like to applaud the Asian Development Bank for its commitment to participating in this constituency for reform, particularly in supporting decentralization reforms in our country. Our journey in our reform agenda so far is not without difficulty, but we have the momentum now. With the President's moral courage and political will to implement a clear agenda for people empowerment, our efforts are now bearing fruit in terms of stronger economic growth, renewed investor and donor confidence, and unprecedentedly high public trust in the government and its institutions. What matters now is to ensure that we move forward to our destination, not in the reverse. In local governance, we want to continue to devolve and not re-centralize. With a strong constituency for reform, we believe that any reversal will lead to grave political and economic consequences. To further move us forward, one thing should continue to inspire us. That same inspiration that installed the President in 2010, that is people power. A paradigm for progress through the active and meaningful participation of citizens in governance. Not just in the streets, not just in the voting booths, but in the less dramatic but important day-to-day challenges of governance. Thank you, and once again, good morning.
Vice President Groff, Secretary Abad, thank you very much for your welcoming and opening comments. Before we move now to the photo session, I'd just like to acknowledge the presence of a few other gentlemen here and a lady as well. Director General Kazu Sakai. Kazu is the Director General of the Strategy and Policy Department, which hosts the Community of Practice of the Asia Pacific. Deputy Director General Jim Nugent of the Southeast Asia Department, and Mr. Neeraj Jain, who's the Country Director for the Philippines. And of course, I'd like to also acknowledge Ms. Noriko Ogawa, who heads the Results Unit, which has been the unit, actually my immediate boss as well, so that helps. Okay, so if I could just invite Secretary Abad and Vice President Groff and our other colleagues to the photo session now. It would be just directly outside. Thank you. Thank you very much. It was a very contextual speech. And I wasn't even asked for talking points.
Very good.
Good morning, everybody. Let's now start our first working session. I'd like to introduce Ms. Teresa Terminazian, one of our experts who will be going through the forum outline and the objectives. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone, colleagues from far and close. It's a pleasure to be here, and I would like to begin by thanking very warmly the ADB and the IDB for setting up this very interesting forum and for the opportunity, personally for myself and my two colleagues from the US to speak at this forum. This forum, I would also want to say a particular word of thanks to Farzana and their team for all the cooperation that they have extended to us during the preparation for the forum, the warm hospitality with which we have been received. Thank you very much, Farzana. We hope that this seminar will live up to your expectations and will improve and deepen the involvement of both the ADB and the IDB in this very important area of policy. This seminar represents really a very good opportunity for an exchange of views among the participants who are all involved in policy making in the decentralization area about the challenges of designing, reforming, and implementing sound fiscal decentralization arrangement. Why is this important? It is important because decentralization is here to stay and to grow. As Secretary Abad said, this is a manifestation of the increasing the trend towards greater and greater democratization in societies around the world, not only developed but also in the emerging and developing world. And decentralization is driven by political economy factors, in particular, as I said, the trend towards democratization. But it is also has important implications for economic welfare, for stability, economic stability, and for fiscal sustainability. Depending on how it is designed and implemented, it can improve or worsen economic conditions. Therefore, it is very useful for all of us here to reflect about what are the features of a good intergovernmental fiscal system that will promote the objectives of improved welfare of citizens, better delivery of public goods and services at the local level, increased political accountability of voters, and also economic stability and sustainable fiscal conditions, which are essential for long-term sustained economic growth. The seminar will focus on three major areas. The macroeconomic implications of decentralization, which I will be the initial presenter. Then the financing of decentralized functions, both own revenues and intergovernmental transfers. And finally, the assignment of spending responsibility to various levels of government, and what are sound management of decentralized practices for decentralized spending, which will be covered by Professor Ahmad. These three areas are clearly interrelated, and therefore, inevitably, there will be some overlap between the various sessions. But you will also hear different perspectives on the issues from the three different experts who have many ideas in common, and quite a lot of background in common, but at the same time have on some somewhat different takes, and I think that will be interesting for you. But more importantly, you will have the benefit of learning from each other. And you bring the real-life perspective to this. I mean, having lived through, in various capacities, through the process of management of decentralized systems. I will go very quickly through the agenda. The first session will be conducted by Farzana Ahmed. She will explain briefly something that you are all familiar with, the framework for management for development results, but more importantly, how decentralization fits into this framework. And Roberto Garcia Lopez, who is the secretary for the COPLAC, for the Community of Practice for Latin America and the Caribbean, will comment and provide the Latin American perspective on the same issues. We will then go into the core of the issues for the seminar. First, I will begin with a presentation on decentralization and what it means for central finance authorities, taking particularly the macroeconomic and the fiscal sustainability perspectives. And this will be followed by some commentaries from my colleagues Paul Smoke and Etisham Ahmad, and from some lead discussants from countries. But it will be followed then by a roundtable dialogue. And I would like to stress that really we hope for a very active participation of all of you in this roundtable dialogue, because this is the best opportunity to learn from each other. Following lunch, we will have a session which will be led by Professor Paul Smoke of New York University on the design and management of decentralized revenues and transfers, followed again with discussions by myself and Etisham, and country responses from some lead discussants and a further discussion. And tomorrow morning, we will have a session on the design and management of decentralized spending and transfers, so the other side of the decentralization process, again with followed by lead discussants and country responses and a roundtable dialogue. The rules of the game are that in order to meet such a sort of, in a short period, such an ambitious agenda, we will need to stick closely to allotted time slots. So 30 minutes for each presenter, 10 minutes for each of the lead discussants, and then about more or less an hour for roundtable discussions, in which I would hope that all the interventions will be very focused on the subject of the session. So if you have issues which are more related to another session, please deal with them in the next session. There will be some signs in the back by Christina, which will indicate when 5 minutes, 2 minutes, and 1 minute, or the end, the red card for the presentation. This is to help you to keep with the allotted time. What are we hoping to get out of this seminar? Well, we are not expecting, one-size-fits-all prescriptions. This was said before during the introductory session, and I want to stress that again. What we want is to promote a dialogue and reflection on the various challenges that fiscal decentralization poses for economic management. And of course, economic management is only one of the dimensions of fiscal decentralization, but this is what we are going to be focusing about in this seminar. And we hope that in the closing panel, we will be able to draw some of these lessons for you to reflect how they can be applicable in your own country circumstances. Because what is very clear is that there is no immediate translation of one country experience into another country's condition. We need all to think about how the specific economic, institutional, historical, legal, and social, political framework of the country conditions, the applicability of the lessons from theory and other countries' practice for one's own country. This will be followed then by a discussion with the ADB board and the senior management in the afternoon of tomorrow to focus on particularly on how the multilateral development banks, especially the ADB and the IDB, can work with country authorities in improving the framework for decentralization and with individual subnational governments to improve their own management, both on the revenue and the expenditure side. So this is a very ambitious program, but I think it's an exciting one, and I hope you are all going to be very active and interested participants. I know that some of us, all of us, most of us, are suffering from some jet lag, but we hope that the discussion will be interesting enough to keep us well awake. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I will begin and, of course, invite my counterpart, Roberto, to join me here. So I'd just like to put things a little bit in context in terms of, we've talked about communities of practice. Stephen mentioned the fact that the Asian Development Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank support communities of practice on managing for development results. And he also did mention the African Development Bank, which also has the African Community of Practice. Well, following the Paris Declaration in 2005, the challenge that was put to the development partners was how to actually, to promote the community, the issue of managing for development results at the country level. And what is the best vehicle to do so? So the communities of practice was identified as something that would be a useful vehicle to do so. Of course, it's not the only means by which we promote managing for development results. So 2005, 2006 was when the Asia Pacific Community of Practice was established. And Roberto, Community of Practice Latin America, 2007, and I think the African Community of Practice happened soon after. So what did the communities of practice do? Well, this works. Of course, they were established to share good practices and engage in the important South-South dialogue. And of course, leading up to the high-level forum last year, the communities of practice had quite a critical role on defining the results agenda at the high-level forum. And prior to that, of course, we have been interacting at the OECD. But during the course of the dialogue at the various regional levels, what was quite clear is that in order for the community of practice to be more effective, there has to be a little bit more focus. Managing for development results is seen to be very much a sort of an esoteric term. And the idea was, how can we make this real so that it can result in real actions and delivery on the ground? So, particularly the community of practice of Latin America and ourselves, we sort of try to define what managing for development results means for us. And for the Asia Pacific community of practice, we called it the MFDR framework. I think in community practice of Latin America, you refer to as the Sorry? SEP. Yes, okay.
Is what we call the index for MFDR or the product evaluation tool.
Okay, so the starting point of the framework was, as I said, where do we make the focus? Now, when we're looking at good governance and the delivery of results on the ground, and you want high quality results to achieved and sustained, of course, the target is development effectiveness. And who are the key players? Well, of course, we do have the donors, ADB and the Inter-American Development Bank and the other multilateral banks, and of course the bilaterals. And of course these institutions have gone and looked at their own results orientation. There are of course the other effective actors such as the public sector and the NGOs. But by far the greater player in the development effectiveness agenda, of course, is the public sector. And so therefore the focus on the managing for development results agenda was really looking at public sector management. And this is something that is common through all the 3 communities of practice. And what has happened over the last few years is that the Asia-Pacific Community of Practice has developed a framework which I will go through in a minute, and Roberto will add the perspectives of the Community of Practice of Latin America and the Caribbean. Okay, so what are the key features of the framework? All of you have been actually given the framework, I think, in the USB port or a hard copy, so I'm not going to go through it in detail, just briefly skim over it. As Teresa mentioned, most of you are practitioners in the field, so you will be very familiar with the term. What the framework is nothing new. What it really aimed to do was pull together all the different dialogues about results and its impact on public sector management, and put it together so it could be a document that can create some consistency of the dialogue between development partners and, of course, the countries that we deal with. And at the same time, perhaps, as Roberto was referring, could be used as an analytical tool, the way we look at public sector management. So what are the key features? The starting point of the framework was to look at the concept of management. And management, as we all know, can be disaggregated into essentially 5 core components. We plan, we budget, we implement, we monitor, and evaluate. When we take those 5 components and translate that at a country level, well, the plan is a national development plan, the budget, the national budget. The implementation is the activities of the various line agencies, and of course the monitoring that is also done by both the line agencies and central agencies, and the evaluation process that is also undertaken. So these are 5 core functions. Of course, in countries, these functions have sometimes also become institutionalized in terms of the Ministry of Finance or the Ministry of Budget. So the challenge of the Managing for Development Results agenda is how do we pull together these 5 components of management, given the fact that they are the core elements in order to be able to deliver results on the ground. So what the framework says is that at the starting point, each of those components of planning, budgeting, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation need to be results orientated. So when we plan, we need to plan for results. So what does that mean? In the context of the framework, it is looked at what the countries have actually been doing and look at the national development plans. And what has happened is that the results orientation of the planning process has meant that when we plan, we need to really clearly define our different levels of results. Now, we talk in terms of impact, outcomes, and outputs, but others may talk about objectives and goals. It doesn't really matter. As long as the levels of results are clearly defined, and we can cascade the definition of the different levels of results from a vision to something that is operational on the ground. That's what the planning for results should aim to do. And of course, for each level of results, we need to look at the indicators and targets that we would like to achieve. So if you plan without having indicators and targets, you might still be planning, but it would just simply be a statement, a wish list, more or less. It wouldn't be planning for results. And that's very simplistically put, but in reality, as I will give an example, it's probably more complicated when trying to do it in practice. And of course, when you budget, the orientation is, of course, we look to budget for results. And what this means is basically reorienting the budgeting process from focusing on inputs to focusing on outputs. Now, this is not easily done because in most ministries of finance, of course, and most budget agencies, the tendency, of course, is that you look at what happened last year. It's pretty backward looking, and then you look to add and see what happens next year. But if you want to really make the budgeting process something that is forward thinking, you have to then really think about how we orientate the linkage of the inputs to the outputs we want to achieve, or perhaps the activities we want to undertake to deliver on the outputs to achieve the outcomes. So that's, and you would have heard of the terms, obviously, of medium-term expenditure frameworks, performance-based budgeting. All of that is part of the process. And probably the budget for results is the most difficult area of change. Similarly, when we go around the cycle, we talk about the orientation of the implementation agencies and the people, the policies, and the processes to make those results orientated. When you talk about monitoring for results, of course, it's no point setting up a monitoring system for monitoring results per se. It must be orientated towards the results that are coming out of the planning process. So the first, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because in the booklet that you've got, we've actually clearly defined what we mean by the core results attributes for each of those components. So the first feature is the fact that each of the components of planning, budgeting, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation need to be results orientated. The second is really recognizing that individually being results orientated perhaps will not be sufficient. If we need all of these 5 components to work together, there must be the focus on common results. And of course, at a country level, we're talking about the national development objectives. But of course, the planning ministry tends to focus very much on outcomes. The budgeting, the ministries of finance tend to focus on outputs. The implementation agency focus on activities. All of them say that they're focused on results. So we need to have the concept of a common set of results. And the third dimension identifies the fact that there are clear linkages. When you're planning for results, you have to think in terms of the resource envelope in which you're planning. You can't plan in isolation, otherwise it becomes a bit pie in the sky kind of planning. And similarly, when you budget for results, the results that you're trying to achieve must really come out of a planning process. Now, in a lot of countries, the tension between the planning and budgeting, of course, is always there. We've experienced it in terms of the institutional challenges. And what this framework recognizes that essentially that there's the political economy dimensions of the institutions and the processes having to work together. So the third dimension is looking at the interdependency between the various components. And I'm not going to, again, go through that in detail because I'm sure all of you are aware of the challenges that you face. The diagram simplistically puts it as a cycle, but in reality, of course, the interdependency is not just between planning and budgeting and then implementation, but also maybe directly between planning and monitoring and between evaluation and budget. But it's just simplistically put, what we're trying to say is that we need to recognize that interdependency. The final feature is the one that probably is most pertinent to this forum is the concept of horizontal and vertical integration. And this essentially recognizes that governments don't just work at the national level. Where countries work at the subnational level as well, and at the same time we have the concept of a sector approach as well. So horizontal and vertical integration, if I was to show on this slide, recognizes that in a sense, a lot of the development now happens has to happen as a consequence of the coordination between different sector agencies, and this is what we refer to as the horizontal integration. And the second recognizes, of course, the vertical dimension between national and subnational levels of government. Now, when I presented this framework to the experts, they really questioned the term integration. Because what decentralization and this conference is about is recognizing the fact that the different levels of government need to work together and there needs to be effective coordination. Integration in this framework doesn't mean a directional approach whereby the central government would dictate to the local government. It is just recognizing the fact that these different levels of government actually exist and there is a need for coordination. And what this framework actually says is we need to be aware that this coordination exists. How it exists, of course, will depend on the degree of decentralization. It would have to be contextualized within the country, and the way in which the different components of planning, budgeting, implementation, monitoring, and evaluate will coordinate, again, would depend on the degree of control, the accountability between these various levels of government. So horizontal and vertical integration is just a general term to use in terms of representing the importance of coordination at the various levels of government. Okay, so if I was to take a very simplistic example, if we were looking at a national goal, say, for example, increased employment, and we're looking at the education sector, we may be looking to define an outcome to improve literacy, and outputs to maybe improve access, improve quality, and the activities, of course, to build the schools and train the teachers. Now, this is a very traditional approach to any kind of education project. But of course, when you look at it at a country level, and I mentioned that the planning for results, one of the key things is to really identify the relationship between the different levels of results. This is not necessarily perhaps the case in many countries. Improving literacy to increase employment, well, perhaps if you're in the southern state of Karnataka in India, improving literacy would not increase employment because there its literacy is about 100%, almost 100%, and what they would be looking for perhaps is maybe diversified skill base. So the relationship that we have between the levels of results must be contextualized with the experiences in the country. Similarly, in order to improve literacy, do we build schools? Do we improve teachers? Well, again, that relationship very much depends on the causal relationship that have been identified at the country level. For example, I'll give a case, an example from Bangladesh, where perhaps to improve literacy, we might be thinking of building more canals in certain parts of the countries, or looking at refurbishing boats. And why would that be? Because in the southern part of Bangladesh, it is very prone to flooding. So the idea of building schools on land is not very productive, and some development partners are supporting building boats, because boats are used to actually pick up the children from the various areas which are flood prone, and the boats are also the location of the school itself. So the relationship between the kind of activity and the output we want to achieve, again, to stress the fact that it has to be contextualized. Of course, once you've defined the different levels of results, I won't go through the whole cycle, of course. We need to think in terms of the budgeting process and aligning the inputs to the outputs that we want to achieve. In terms of implementation, of course, we're looking to build the schools and train the teachers. And in reality, it's easy to say, but very often what tends to happen, and this is where the political economy approach again comes in, is the fact that perhaps the schools are built in areas where they weren't necessarily needed. Perhaps the kinds of teachers that were trained were not the ones that are needed to achieve the objectives. So the clear linkages between these various dimensions of delivering results on the ground have to be taken into account. And of course, when we look at the monitoring and the indicators and the targets, we must clearly look at what we're trying to achieve out of this education process, and look at what the planning process actually had identified in terms of the indicators and targets. And of course, at the end, we would have to make the assessment as, has literacy actually improved? And if it hasn't, then we need to question what? Not simply whether or not we identified the clear linkages between the results, which may or may not be appropriate to in the particular country context, but maybe look at some of the other issues that might have impacted the delivery of the outcome. So it's not as clear-cut to say that, well, if literacy hasn't improved, then perhaps we shouldn't be building schools or training teachers. Perhaps that's what we ought to have done, but we just didn't do it very well, or we didn't allocate enough resources. So the analysis of results on the ground really needs to take into account all these dimensions. And the challenge, of course, is that for the development partners is very often when we go into a particular sector, sometimes we might be focusing on one component and not the other, without thinking of the importance of the integration between all five. And for decentralization, of course, the added complexity is we must look at the coordination, integration at the different levels of government, which then adds a further dimension of complexity. So, and what the framework actually continues to say is that if the public sector management systems actually exhibits these features, then you will have the ability to make informed decisions and room for continuous learning. And we try to emphasize the fact that this is a framework that can be applied in any development context, in any country context, because it essentially is a framework about the principles. It looks simplistic, but when you start to take it into the country context, that's where the real issues will emerge. But we needed to have a framework so that when the communities of practice, the members meet, there is some kind of focus for a common dialogue. And what does that say for capacity development? What it critically recognizes that if we, for example, were looking at the planning process and in the country planning system, what we need to do is to compare the planning systems with some of the core principles of what we mean by results-based planning. And Teresa and other speakers have mentioned about the importance of not trying to take a one-size-fits-all policy. Well, what this frameworks like this, and of course the tool that has been developed by the Community Practice of Latin America, really identify the fact that you can take certain core agreed principles and then apply it to a country system, assess the gaps, identify constraints, and then look for opportunities for capacity development. And of course, who are the best people to do it? Of course, it is yourselves, because you know your systems, you know your country, you know the history, and you can contextualize it at the country level. Have we applied this framework? Well, I'm just going to quickly look and see how when we discussed it in the Philippines, this is the way we quickly charted the Philippines. The planning and the budgeting process independently are quite strong, but the linkages between the planning and budgeting process are relatively weak. Implementation is very much driven by what comes out of the budget process, but implementation on the ground is weak. But very often, the political process tends to derail what actually happens on the ground. And of course, evaluation is a tremendous challenge, because there are significant and many varied monitoring processes in the Philippines, but they're not pulled together sufficiently well enough to be focused on the national objectives that are about to be achieved. At the other extreme, we picked Korea, and when we looked at the Korean example, what we see is that they don't actually have a Ministry of Planning or Budget. They've actually combined them into a Ministry of Strategy and Finance. And Korea is clearly far more advanced. In fact, it's an interesting country to study, because in the lifetime, at least in my lifetime, it has been a country that has gone from a developing to developed status quite rapidly. And we can chart the progress that Korea has made. And Korea used to have very strong planning and budgeting, but just recently, well, about 10 or 15 years ago, they merged the two. And the strength in Korea, of course, is that they're very much now focusing on evaluation at the policy level. Individual ministries are now completely in charge. The minister clearly defines, takes national objectives, clearly defines his own outcomes, objectives, and he has to deliver on the ground. And if he doesn't deliver, then he'll lose his job. But they don't have this segregation of the 5 components into various agencies. I might hand over to Roberto. You might want to give some insights into the process that is followed in the community of practice in terms of management development. Up to you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. More or less in the same line what Farzana has just said, we have a very close framework for Latin America in terms of managing for development results. But we go further, and what we did, we construct an index. This index has 140 indicators, and is measured from 0 to 5. 0 is that the indicator, it doesn't exist at all. For example, have you a plan? No, then you get a 0. But if you are implementing a plan for results, then you get a 5. 0, you are in the worst scenario. 5 is the best scenario, almost irreal, because that's when all the stars are working together. In the case of Latin America, out of the 26 countries in the region, we can assess in 2008, 2009, 25. And that's the slide that you have in front. That's the ranking of the 26 countries. The average for the countries is 1.9. What means 1.9 in this index? If we are ranking from 0 to 5 and you get 1.9, that means that you are not even in the middle of the road. You have a lot of room to improve when you are implementing managing for results. And then we have 4 countries, Chile, Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil, that are the most advanced countries. And then you have a lot of countries in the middle, and some countries that still are in a very preliminary stage. All the indicators have different weights, and it depends how close you are to implement the results, you get higher weight. This takes more than 2 years, a lot of money, and but now some countries are using this index in the planning system and in the budget system as a standard to reach a better situation that they used to be. We also apply this index to Korea that Farzana just mentioned, and Korea is above Chile and the other countries get a 4.4. And why we did that? Because when we start discussing this in the region, we say, well, for most countries it seems that if we can reach Chile or Brazil, then it's a high standard. But then we bring a country from another region, in this case Korea, and say, no, the standard is not Chile. The standard could be a higher standard. Also, after we did this, right now we are in the process to update the index, and we hope it's going to be finished by the middle of next year. And then we want to compare what happened in the last 3 years, from the start to 2009 to 2012. And we hope that the average of Latin America moves from 1.9 to 2.5. Is this a large improvement? No, it's not a large improvement, but it's a best situation after what we see a very important trend in the region. And in this purpose, and I support everything what Farzana has said, we strongly believe that you need two main conditions to implement managing for results at the country level. The first one is political leadership to implement. You have the tools, you know how to manage the tools, but if you don't have in place political leadership, nothing is going to happen. But also, only with political leadership is not enough. You need technical leadership. You need the combination of these two. If you have political leadership, but you don't have enough technical servants very trained in this area, you also are going to fail. And because this seminar is about decentralization, and decentralization is about subnational government, we also developed this index to subnational level. And it's more or less the same, but the main difference is in the side of income or revenues, because the revenue of the subnational government are quite different from the national government. Then we apply up to date this index at subnational level to around 60 subnational government, and we classify the subnational government in 4 categories. One category is capital city. These 4 categories are absolutely different animals. Capital city has different functions, has different revenues. And one of the main advantage of the capital city is that around, at least in Latin America, on average, around 80% of the revenues are own revenues, okay? Then you have a lot of room to manage for results. If you don't have own revenues, and you are a subnational government, and 80 or 90% of the revenues depends on cash transfers or transfers that are allocated to different services, it's very difficult to manage for results or by results. And what you see in this slide are 2 different animals. One is capital cities are in red. For example, Bogota is the capital of Colombia, and he gets a very high number in the index. And the other ones that are not in red are states or province, and normally in federal governments. And then we have 2 other subnational entities that are not here. We don't have enough time to go in details, but are the municipality level. And within the municipality level, we have 2 categories, rural municipalities and urban municipalities, okay? These are 4 subnational government, completely different functions, different revenues, different approach to service the people. Finally, because Farzana is going to show me the red, no, I cannot see it, it's too far. I just want to thank Farzana and all the Asian Development Bank team for make possible this seminar. And even the distance are far, I think that we are working very close and in more or less in the same page. Thank you so much, Farzana.
I guess that, just to conclude, there's one slide that we try to present, particularly from the community of practice when we're talking to donors, is that we really see that it's very important for the donor community to actually support public sector management. Very often it's actually forgotten because it's not the health sector or the education sector, but we see it as very much as a cross-cutting area that needs to be looked at. And we provide a tool to be able to look at the public sector management through the results lens, and it can be used at a sector level as well. And what we then say is, of course, that if the public sector management is strengthened, of course, it is mutually beneficial for the donor community as well. It's something you might want to bear in mind when we have the discussion with the board tomorrow in terms of what the emphasis could be. Okay, so I will just leave the floor open now to questions, if you might have to, Roberto or myself.
Yes. Are you sure? Yes. I'm in the audience now, since you were the presenters. I was very intrigued by the statement by Roberto about that managing for results is better in capital cities, where most of the revenues are own revenues. Does this mean that receipt of transfers creates a problem for management for result? And if so, why? Is it because the transfers are discretionary and therefore are uncertain? Is it because or is it because the uncertainty is even when they are formula-based? But in that case, probably also revenues would be formula-based. I mean, would be uncertain because they reflect, changes in the economic conditions. I think it's important to make this clear because it has implications for the design of transfers. If it is a problem that there is too much discretion or earmarking, which means superimposing central government, let's say, priorities over local priorities, then this is one problem. If it's a problem of the uncertainty of revenues, then and the instability of revenues, for instance, revenues based on natural resources, then I think it's important to have other. There are other tools to deal with this. For instance, creating stabilization of funds, having a formula that smooth the transfers over the economic cycle, and so on and so forth. So that's my question.
Why don't we put it to the floor to answer? Yeah.
The point I want to raise is one of the principles of managing for results is that you can allocate resources to the best value for money. And that means, in other terms, that if a program is working well, you can put more money there. And you cut the programs that are not getting the results that you expect. That's the main issue. Now, if you are a decentralized government, a municipality or a province, but all your revenues that came from the central government, and in some cases is more than 90%, are directly allocated to a specific program. This money is for water, this money is for education, but also is for traditional education, is for traditional way to make water and sanitation, then you don't have at that level any chance to change the allocation of the resources. Then one of the principles that we discuss as a national level, that unless you have to have room for, let's say, 15% of the resources that where you can manage and put where you want to put the money. Of course, there are different approaches. You can have the fiscal funds. You can have also in the decentralization process of resources, go with match funds that in some countries are trying to. If you raise more money, I get more money to you, or I send more money to you. But still the problem is if the subnational government that are close to the people and the needs of the people has not the ability to reallocate resources, you don't have enough room to manage for results.
So it's the problem of the earmarking. mainly. That is.
Yeah, the earmarking from the central government.
In Latin America.
Yeah.
I was wondering if it's.
Pak Maranto from Indonesia.
Thank you. Well, there's two issues I would like to raise. First is relating to the presentation of Varsana. You are mentioning about the effectiveness of planning, budgeting, implementation, and etc. I just wondering how is the experience of most countries related to the role of politician? Because if we are dealing with the democratization, well, the development of the democratization, there are some countries which the parliament is discussing very detail of the appropriation of the budget. So I would like to hear about that. The second issue is related to the transfer to subnational government. It is very interesting, the experience of Latin America. In the case of Indonesia, I think the transfer goes to the subnational government is it's around 80% of the local budget. But fortunately, 80% of it is in the form of general purpose grant. So the local government, the subnational government, have some discretion to plan and to allocate this money. The problem again is the intervention of the political group. Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions, or I can proceed? Yes, Mr. Khalid from Pakistan.
Thank you very much for providing me opportunity. We are implementing a result-based budgeting program named Medium Terms Budgetary Framework, MTBF, Medium Terms Budgetary Framework. We give 3 years indicative budget allocation ceilings to the line ministries, that this much is our capacity to finance. And line ministries have been empowered to set their priorities, where to spend more, where to spend less. But the problem we are facing is, their estimation of their targets, objectives and goals is generally overestimated and not much quantified. Then when we come to the performance evaluation of those, results, we are not well equipped to monitor. First of all, their targets and objectives are not, quantified. Secondly, we don't have capacity. So everything appears as if we are doing something very fictitious and just to show in the books, but some concrete results are not coming. We have experienced for the last 2-3 years. What should be the course of action for materializing those programs?
From Malaysia.
Thank you. I would like to add what Mr. Maranto mentioned. Because we have, in Malaysia, we have a 5-year plan, and we have setting a national development framework. We have 30 national program, and each program we allocate allocation. But again, our problem is when we want to educate our politician, because we have priorities. Let's say we priority for economic sector, but ministers involved in defense also want the allocation. So it's very difficult for us to educate the politician. So I would like to know about the experience in Latin America, Mr. Roberto, how you handle this kind of situation. Thank you.
I might just take the issue, Pak Maranto mentioned the issue of the political interference in the process, and I guess with my limited knowledge of Indonesia, it is really much about the fact that once the national plan is agreed, then the parliament wants to scrutinize at every level of results. And similarly, when it comes to releasing the funds as well, the parliamentary members get involved. So how does the framework actually deal with that? Well, it doesn't actually provide a solution for it other than identifying that if, for example, you don't a budget for the activities and the objectives that you initially set out to achieve, and you don't try and deliver that on the ground, of course you're not delivering on the intended results. And what we're trying to do in this framework is basically highlight the importance of understanding those linkages, and also to see what perhaps are the other areas that actually stop. It's not just the politicians. Very often what we see is, for example, when trying to release the funds at the subnational level, very often the allotment process, as they call it, is delayed. So in a sense, many subnational governments we see the irony of subnational governments on one hand crying poor because they don't have enough money to deliver on the services they have to provide, but at the same time, at the end of the year, they have unspent budgets. And some of that is actually identified in terms of the fact that the simple allotment process and the release of the funds from the treasury systems gets slowed down. So it doesn't actually answer how we deal with the interference of the process of someone trying to derail the delivery of the intended results, but just highlights the challenges that, in fact, if you don't have all these dimensions working together, that the results will not be delivered. Roberto, you might want to.
One thing that is very important in your question about selling the results approach to politicians is to be clear about what or which are the main results that the politicians are expected. And sometimes are not the same that the technical people is working on. But in the region, at least we have now some countries where the politicians understand very well, that results that are important for the people can be traduced in terms of votes. And that's a result that is very, very clear for politicians. If I get these results, I can be reelected, or at least my party can win the next election. This is something that, and now I see in the region a lot of politicians that start maybe 5 or 8 years ago. It wasn't in the agenda of the politician, the results approach. Now everybody is talking about results approach. Not everybody is implementing. That's a different thing. But at least they start talking, and some main politicians in some countries understand very clear that results is a good business for politicians. And in terms of your question about the allocation of ceilings, and this has to do with the medium-term fiscal framework, etc. One thing that we see in the region, in Latin America, is that is a sort of misunderstanding on purpose between the central ministries and the line ministers. What I mean with this, you say, the central ministers say, these are the ceilings. And the line ministers say, these are the floors. And now we are going to try to get in the Congress discussion or whatever, more of that. It's your ceiling, but it's my floor. And this is something that is happening in the region very frequently also. But just to be everybody more comfortable, I just came from a meeting in Paris yesterday with the OECD countries discussing budget for results after the financial crisis, and the discussions are more or less the same. And there is some fatigue, there is a rediscussion with the politicians in terms of implementing results approach and also budget for results. But the difference is that they are also in the same page in terms of results. They are moving to results. The difference with our countries is that they want results to keep the development stage where they are. But we need results to move to that stage. And for that purpose, the OECD countries has around 40 points of the GDP to expend. And at least in our region in Latin America, we have only 20. That's half of the resources to provide to the citizens the same quality and the same quantity of goods and service.
Countries also have much higher tax burdens, and therefore, they sort of, the role of the state is really different. May I ask?
I think we just have a couple of questions from the floor here from Afghanistan.
Thank you very much. I think it's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for very much informative presentations. Couple of things for Afghanistan, though we're moving with the initial years of practicing results-based management. But from looking to the issue from two enabling opportunities. What has been practiced in the past in the 10 years in Afghanistan was pretty much we're running and we were trying to implement things that were not in appropriate time. Way forward, I think pretty much focus would be on results, particularly making the Tokyo mutual accountability framework working. So it's an opportunity for the result-based management practices to be really practiced in real terms. The second enabler, I see the concept you've come up with, the integration of vertical and horizontal, particularly in the case of the organization I'm working, which is the champion to push for more of deconcentration practices, and would be a new area for ADB to focus. There wasn't that much of really support to subnational governance practices and processes. So I think this new concept, how much that is developed, would be very much happy to more learn on that. And I think it would be a critical practice to clarify the functions of these different levels of entities, the practices they have, both also the political and technical understanding to deliver results. And eventually will take us, this concept will help us to more see how this first stages of decentralization, which is deconcentration in the case of Afghanistan, which is a very excessively centralized state, to bring more the public sector closer to the people. So I would be very much like to hear on this concept and see more practices in the ground in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Bangladesh?
In fact, I don't have any question. I just want to make some comments particularly on the Latin experience. Regarding the central government finance, as Mr. Khalek told from Pakistan, we have the same experience in MTBF. But which I want to concentrate on the subnational level, the local government. We have three tiers of local government, the Union Parishad, the lowest tier, then Upazila Parishad, then Jila Parishad, district, sub-district, and union. At the union level, we are practicing some result-oriented budgeting, or we should say grant from the government. And this is there are two types of grant from the central government to the Union Parishad, the lowest tier. One is block-based grant. It is following a standard, geographical area, population, etc. And one is performance-based grant. But for that, this PBG, we use a simplified model of performances, where in fact other institute of the government also took part, like birth and death registration, like the enrolling in the primary schools, just decreasing the dropout, and sanitation, so forth. But I am particularly interested in your index, which you have mentioned, with 140 indicators. And it is certainly detailed workout, and certainly that will be helpful for us in financing our local government, our Union Parishad and Upazila Parishad in future, just to improve the system of benchmarking or going for further, go further for the orientation towards the result, getting better results. In central government, it is cumbersome. Thus, as there are country expenses enumerated here. In Bangladesh also we have very good, I think, national plan, very good budgeting, but very weak in implementing and monitoring. Certainly we need to work a lot in those areas. Thank you.
I've been shown the red flag from my colleague at the back. I just wanted to touch on one point. Teresa, I know you wanted to say something, but probably it's the issue of the capacity, because we're going to talk in detail about revenue and expenditure issues later on. But it's an interesting point about capacity, and this that came out from Pakistan, is that can we reasonably say that there needs to be a certain minimum capacity in order for the results agenda to make sense? Sometimes, and I think the conclusion probably is that yes, that before we start to put a lot of jargon on very poor subnational levels of government, we really think about the capacity to absorb and to be able to deliver. And hand in hand, of course, goes with the issue there, of course, is that when you start to talk about performance-based budgeting, and I know Roberto talked about the issue whether you penalize governments or not. Of course, there is the other issue is that if you are poorly performing because of poor capacity, perhaps it should be the reverse, that we actually put more resources in order to help you help achieve results. So these are the sort of questions that I think that are there's no clear solution, but the framework does not address the issue of what you do in a situation where the results they have difficulty delivering the results, because it again has to be looked at in the country context. We might sort of and then go straight into the coffee break. And did you want to add something? Yes.
Can I ask you a quick question? Is there any clear link between them, the development for results and the Millennium targets?
Of course, I mean, I'll just quickly say that the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals that you're talking about, and of course now we're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. From the perspective of the framework and the community practice, of course, those goals are just a clearer definition of certain results that have been internationally agreed to be delivered by individual countries. And of course, the challenge that has come across when we look at the review of the MDGs, because they are results that everybody has commonly agreed, is that when you translate that at the country level, it means different results for different countries. The definitions are not quite clear. And of course, the implementation has been very uneven across the different regions. So of course, there's a clear linkage to the extent that the MDGs are internationally agreed set of results. We might break here and maybe continue the conversation over the coffee and tea break. It's just outside. I'm sure you want to break as well. Thank you. I'm going to take him up on that offer. I'm going to take him up on that offer from Bangladesh in order to develop some kind of, if we can use the ProDev tool.
Yeah, at national level, you know that at national level, we have some cases that are doing best at the national level.
Maybe we can invite you to
get started with the first session, which has an ambitious title, Promoting Effective Decentralization, the Role of Central Finance Agencies. This presentation will cover essentially 5 questions. Very briefly, why decentralize? And then, why is a hard budget constraint for subnational governments needed to minimize the risks and maximize the results of decentralization? And I will focus primarily on the macroeconomic risks, but I want to stress that having a hard budget constraint is necessary also for efficient and effective decentralization. Then, how to ensure hard budget constraints, various mechanisms that have they range from reliance on market discipline to more cooperative, what I call cooperative federalist arrangements, to more hierarchical mechanisms of control on borrowing by subnational governments, and to fiscal rules. And then I make some considerations on what if the crisis prevention approach doesn't work, and what are the best practices in resolving subnational fiscal crises, which unfortunately do happen, and I will give some examples. And finally, it's sort of by way of summarizing a little bit, what are the mistakes to be avoided on the part of central finance agencies, and what are the things that central finance agencies can do to promote fiscally responsible and effective decentralization. So very briefly, why decentralize? I think we already spoke a little bit about this. The traditional normative argument dating back to Oates, Thibaut, Musgrave, and so on, is that we should decentralize to promote efficiency in resource allocation, because governments that are closer to the people are better able to reflect in their budgetary choices the preferences of the people. So efficiency in resource allocation and preference matching. Of course, the underlying assumption of this argument are that the government is benevolent, that citizens are mobile, that is, they can vote with their feet if they don't like the government choices. This traditional normative argument has come under a lot of attack in recent decades, particularly by the so-called second generation positive federalism theories, which emphasize the political economy objectives of decentralization, which can range from deepening democratization trends to preventing ethnic conflict to diffusing secessionist tendencies. And these theories also discard the assumption of benevolent government, recognizing that politicians follow essentially their own, try to maximize their own welfare, which is equivalent to re-election. And so these theories focus on how incentives and institutions, in particular electoral systems, legal frameworks, subnational capacity constraints, shape the decentralization process and its results in terms of efficiency and the citizen welfare. Also, what has emerged over the last several decades has been concerns about the risks posed by decentralization for macroeconomic management. These risks are essentially of two types. On the one hand, reduced central government control of fiscal stabilization instruments, because now more of spending and to some extent of revenues is in the hands and under the control of the subnational governments, and the risks of more importantly, the risks of unsustainable subnational fiscal behavior. Why is a subnational hard budget constraint necessary for successful decentralization? And what do we mean by subnational hard budget constraint? A poorly designed and implemented decentralization can lead to the emergence of a subnational soft budget constraint. This occurs when a subnational entity expects to be able to increase its spending without carrying the cost of that spending. This, of course, creates incentive to overspend, so to run deficits and accumulate debt, and also discourages efforts to mobilize own revenues and to be efficient in spending. So it has both macroeconomic risks effect and fiscal sustainability risks effect, but also effects in terms of efficiency and welfare. Therefore, it can lead to macroeconomic instability and debt crisis, and to poor value for money in the delivery of subnational goods and services. What are the main causes of subnational soft budget constraints? First of all, and I will go through all of them, but mostly focusing on the first part, because some of these, the latter ones, will be more explained in the subsequent session by my colleagues. A first flaw is relying on market discipline when preconditions for its effectiveness are not there. I will explain in the subsequent slide. Second is ineffective cooperative federalism arrangements, weaknesses in more hierarchical mechanisms of control, in particular significant discretion in the direct central government control over subnational borrowing, and inappropriate design or inadequate enforcement of subnational fiscal rules. Substantial discretion in intergovernmental transfers, little or no revenue autonomy for subnational governments, and unclear expenditure assignments or unfunded mandates. So, first of all, reliance on market discipline when the conditions for its effective working are not there can lead to subnational soft budget constraint. The conditions for market discipline to be effective in controlling subnational borrowing are quite demanding. First of all, most important is that there should be a consistent record of no bailouts of subnational governments in financial difficulty. Also that the financial markets should be well developed and they should be competitive. And in particular, that there should be no privileged access of subnational government to credit. Very often we see, especially in developing countries, that subnational governments have preferential access to credit, either because the banks have portfolio requirements that require them to invest part of their portfolio in subnational debt, or because they have their own banks. I mean, an example in Brazil, this was a major source of soft budget constraints for the states, the fact that the states had their own banks and were able to get unlimited, virtually, access to bank credit from them. Absolutely fundamental, and this is a leitmotif that will come back over and over again in the sessions to come, is that subnational government accounts should be transparent, that there should be reliable, timely information on the operations of the state and local government. Without this information, markets cannot make appropriate judgment on the creditworthiness of the subnational governments, and therefore they make the wrong decisions in providing credit. And also that subnational politicians should be responsive to market signals. And this is, again, not frequently the case, because often markets provide signals which are discontinuous. That is to say, they continue to provide credit until suddenly they stop. And often you don't see even much of an increase in the cost of the credit until all of a sudden concerns emerge about the creditworthiness, and then the financing stops. So if these conditions are not present, it is very likely that subnational governments will not be subject to adequate market discipline, and relying on such market discipline can lead to essentially a soft budget constraint. Another area that can give rise to soft budget constraint is political economy influences on negotiated arrangement. In many countries, well, or at least in some countries, for instance, in Europe, quite often the central government and the subnational governments engage in what we call cooperative federalism model. That is where they agree on limits to the debt that the subnational governments can incur. through a negotiation, a process of negotiation and dialogue. But these mechanisms, as well as administrative control mechanisms, can give rise to subnational soft budget constraints because there is they provide excessive scope for discretion and therefore for political bargaining. Especially, this is the case in countries where the executive is weak and subnational governments have substantial powers in the legislative branch. If they control Congress, they can basically blackmail the central government. Also, there is the likelihood that subnational governments that are aligned politically aligned with the ruling coalition may expect to be favored in these political bargains about the amount of debt that they can take, sometimes above and beyond what they are actually able to service. And finally, in the case, if the central government authorizes specific debt operation, it is then difficult for it to refuse a bailout to a subnational government that is experiencing difficulty in servicing the debt incurred, if it has already obtained the authorization for that. So these negotiated arrangements carry significant risks of giving rise to subnational soft budget constraints. So the demanding preconditions for effective reliance on market discipline and the weaknesses of negotiated arrangements explain why more and more countries are resorting to the adoption of subnational fiscal rules that are growing around the world. Now, according to an IMF survey, basically 90% of developing countries and almost 90% of advanced countries do have some kind of subnational fiscal rule. So it is really, this has grown very fast, and this was not the case. I mean, these figures were close to zero, let's say 3 decades ago. An increasing share of countries uses more than one rule. So the most popular combinations are rules on the budget balance and on the gross debt of the subnational governments. But there are also, there is increasingly a reliance on rules that constrain the growth of subnational expenditures. Fiscal rules, however, are not a magic bullet for ensuring subnational fiscal discipline, because their effectiveness depends on, first of all, the extent of political and social support for these rules. They may remain on paper if they don't have a strong base of political and social support. Also, the robustness of their legal basis. Especially in federal countries, the rules may not have, I mean, the central government may not have the constitutional power to impose rules on the subnational governments, and in this case, the subnational governments have to create their own rules. This is, for example, the case in the United States. The federal government has no possibility of imposing a rule, but most of the states, with the exception actually of the state of Vermont, have adopted their own balanced budget rules. It depends also crucially on the soundness of the design of the rule and on the conditions for its enforcement. I will go very briefly on design and implementation issues, but the paper which I wrote does provide a lot more detail on this, and given the limited time, I will just very briefly touch on some of them. First of all, a question is whether the rules should be imposed by this, or if the central government has the legal authority to impose a rule on subnational governments, should it do so, or should the rules more likely to be observed if they are self-imposed by the subnational units? Well, of course, this you can argue both ways. A centrally imposed rule has less ownership. A self-imposed rule may have greater social and political support in the subnational unit, and so from that point of view be more likely to be implemented, but there is no guarantee that all the self-imposed rules would be consistent and lead to an overall subnational fiscal position that is sustainable for the country as a whole. The issue of coverage is quite important. A rule should be ideally covering not only the operations of subnational governments that are recorded in the budget, but also quasi-fiscal operations and contingent liabilities that are being undertaken, for instance, as a result of private-public partnerships. I think Mr. Ahmad will talk quite a bit about that tomorrow in his session. There are issues regarding the nature of the targets. Should the rule be imposed on or target the overall balance of the budget, or should it target the primary balance? This is the balance excluding interest payments. This is typically the case in Latin America. Personally, I think that a rule targeting a primary balance is preferable from the point of view of the ability of the government to control its execution, because interest payments are more subject to external shocks. But on the other hand, there should be accompanied by a debt rule that requires when the interest payments are rising above a limit consistent with debt sustainability over the medium term, to adjust the primary target. The important design issue is also the degree of flexibility in the rule. Rules that do not include escape clauses, well-specified escape clauses, tend in a situation of fiscal stress to be not implemented. So if it is desirable to include escape clauses that allow a temporary suspension of the rule during periods of shocks that are beyond the control of the authorities. There are also questions about whether the fiscal rules should be cyclically adjusted. In principle, this would be desirable, but there are many practical difficulties which I discuss in some detail in the paper in doing so. Even more important, in my view, than design issues are implementation issues. Rules that are not supported by reasonably robust public sector management systems are unlikely to be implemented. This is particularly the case if there are not good standardized systems of accounting and reporting of government operations, because it's not possible to monitor their compliance and therefore to ensure their implementation. Monitoring of compliance is also an issue. Should it be done by the central government, or should there be an independent fiscal watchdog? Now the trend especially in advanced countries is to create independent fiscal councils that are charged with the watchdog rule. The US, for instance, has had for a long time the Congressional Budget Office, which serves a useful function in not only monitoring the execution of the budget, but also in costing, let's say, the new legislative initiatives and so on, and thereby facilitating the monitoring of the sustainability of the budget. Extremely important are also enforcement tools which have to do with sanctions for non-compliance with the rule, which typically in the case of subnational governments tend to be financial sanctions in the form of withholding of transfers from the higher level governments. And then correction mechanisms. In my view, even more, equally important as sanctions are requirements that deviations from a rule should be corrected over a